All right, let's take a look at financial analysis in more detail. Now, it was part of last week's area, but in this week I wanted to really focus in on the financial analysis section, of course, our class. So let's take a look. Now, what I've got for you here, let me start this. What I've got for you here is a summary of financial analysis, and at this point in time, what I really want to do is just go over some details. So let's take a look. All right, when we talk about financial analysis, the first one to start with is the financial statement itself. These values, such as net income, total assets, total equity, total liabilities, these items, again, such as assets, when compared from one year to the next, might offer a good way to analyze what our business is doing. When we move into these other areas, it gets kind of muddy, but there's this basics of net income in 2016 and 17. What was that? We could just keep going. So the financial statements of themselves offer a lot of value. All right, number two, and this is something that's already been talked about, but that is profitability. So when we talk about profitability, of course, net income is really easy to kind of define. So this idea of profitability, let me see if I can write this a little better, where it's easier for you to follow. So profitability, again, is a second measure. And profitability can be looked at in several ways. And we'll talk more about this in some details, but really just net income, return on assets, return on equity. Again, we'll look at the details later, but these items, again, compared from year to year, but really the idea is how is our earnings? What are we doing as far as financial return? Really, sometimes this is looked at as a percentage value. Now, sometimes it's looked at as whole numbers, so it could be a certain dollar amount. It could be percentage. A lot of times it's a ratio. So the example I have for you here is, what is the percent earnings of our assets? Where's the profit per unit? What are some other examples? What about cost analysis? In other words, what does it cost for us to produce a unit? And if we can produce that at a cheaper level, that turns into a profitable measure as well. The base concept of profitability and financial analysis is what kind of values we're bringing into our business based on the resources we need to use those. So really, profitability, you're looking at lots of things, but that's the idea. What are the dollar amounts we bring in compared to the resources we have? Okay, third one is liquidity. Liquidity is our ability to cover current assets, or current liabilities, I should say, with current assets. Sometimes liquidity is identified by how much cash we have liquid that we can use. Now, liquidity is the ability for an asset to be used for current debt. So the concept of liquidity is sometimes measured in just which assets they are. So current assets are they are the focus. In fact, a bank account is the most liquid asset we have. So what does our bank have in it, and how does that pay for our liabilities or debts we have coming current? So it's really, what kind of current assets do we have compared to the current liabilities, in other words, the current debts that we owe? And that's really the concept of liquidity. So liquidity is just really trying to identify that we have current assets to pay for current liabilities. And since we know the window of time, really we can also identify the amount needed, and that's 2 times. So 2 times, in other words, a ratio of 2, but we want double amount of current assets always on hand to pay for current debt, and that's a good measure. All right, so let's move past liquidity. Liquidity, again, is only current assets. And if we talk about all the assets and all the debt, that's called solvency. So this level is our ability to cover all the debts that we have. So to cover all the liabilities that we have using all of the assets that we have. And so that's this idea of solvency. It's hard to identify how much you have to have. Hopefully you would be able to cover all of your debts with all of your assets. That's just called being solvent. Hopefully you've got more assets than you have liabilities, and that would just become to be more and more the focus. We need to have total assets more than liabilities. You can't really, again, identify an amount because it's hard. There's really no way to judge the length of time. Current assets, liquidity, we know that length of time. It's less than a year of the normal operating cycle. Solvency is looking at your entire business, and so it's really hard to put a a date, or it's really hard to put a dollar amount on it. So solvency is a little harder sometimes to analyze. But when you go from year to year, it's easy to analyze, or easier to analyze all of these. So there's really 4 forms of financial review. It's the statements themselves, it's profitability, it's liquidity, and solvency. So now what we want to do is try to move more into each one of these 4, try to give you some tools in your toolbox to look at some examples, and of course relates to the test that we have coming in a few weeks. So anyway, let's take a look at some more details, but this is an overview of financial analysis.